He was a billionaire, surrounded by applause and luxury. She was a quiet preschool teacher the world barely noticed, until he did. This story will show you that sometimes the simplest soul can heal the deepest wounds. Watch till the end to see why he gave up everything for her. Subscribe now for more stories about true love. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from. Rain tapped rhythmically against the vast floor-to-ceiling windows of Leonid Markov's office. 34 years old, CEO of one of the country's largest construction and tech conglomerates, he sat in an ergonomic leather chair designed more for status than comfort, though it hardly mattered. The skyline of the city stretched endlessly before him, illuminated by late evening lights and the red dots of aircraft blinking lazily over the high-rises. The room was sleek, silent, and immaculate, just like every other space in his carefully curated life. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood and expensive leather, but behind the sheen and polish was a man whose soul had long ago grown numb. Leonid had everything society taught him to value: wealth, influence, physical presence, an army of employees, luxury vehicles, exclusive travel destinations. Yet, beneath the surface, behind his tailored suits and meticulously controlled image, he felt hollow. He had built empires, but never a home, signed deals worth billions, but never made a promise that mattered, attended galas where everyone knew his name, yet left every event feeling like a stranger to them all, and to himself. His latest romantic relationship had ended earlier that morning. Victoria, a high-profile model with whom he had spent the past few months, had left in a storm of raised eyebrows and rolled designer luggage after he refused to buy her a seaside villa. It wasn't the fight that stung, nor the insult she muttered as the elevator doors closed. It was the revelation, once again, that she had never loved him, only the things he could provide. She had loved the lifestyle, the visibility, the prestige, not the man beneath the silk ties and monogrammed cufflinks. It was not the first time. In fact, it had become a predictable pattern. Every time he believed he had found something real, the truth would unravel in the most cliché of ways. He was tired, not just of failed relationships, but of the performance he had to maintain in every aspect of life. The loneliness had grown roots, deep and stubborn, and it wasn't the kind that could be solved by a new acquisition or another weekend in Monaco. That night, something cracked inside him, not with a bang, but with a quiet surrender. He left the office without alerting his driver, walked past the lobby security with his coat collar turned up, and let the rain soak through his shirt as he wandered the nearby streets. The city was alive, but distant, like a film playing behind glass. It was late, but not empty. Occasional laughter from a pub, the hum of traffic, the glow of street lamps reflected in puddles. Leonid walked without aim or destination, letting the rhythm of rain and footsteps fill the silence that usually screamed inside his head. His feet eventually led him to a quiet urban park nestled between residential buildings. It was modest, a small playground, a few benches, swings swaying slightly in the wind, but something about it felt different, safe, unfiltered. He slowed as he heard voices ahead. Children's laughter, high, unguarded, joyful, and above that, a woman's voice, warm, animated, genuine. It was not the synthetic sweetness of socialites, nor the high-pitched pretension of influencers. It was real. Under a soft, overhead lamp, a group of children ran in circles on the grass, chasing each other in a game that made no sense to adults but brought them pure delight. Among them moved a woman in a rain jacket, her hair tied back in a loose bun, damp curls escaping around her face. She ran with the children, arms open like wings, laughing as she let herself be caught. Her energy was radiant and unfiltered. No makeup, no designer brands, no need to impress. Just presence. Leonid watched from a distance, his hands buried in his coat pockets. He didn't know why he stopped walking. He didn't know what made him lean on the fence and stay. But something in that moment reached through the fog of his detachment and tapped at the part of him that had long since shut down. The children eventually tired and gathered around the woman as she handed out small cartons of juice from a cloth tote. She knelt to tie a little boy's shoelaces, gently brushed a girl's wet hair out of her eyes. Her motions were instinctive, caring, unhurried. Not once did she look around to see if anyone was watching. She wasn't performing. She simply existed in that space with them, and in doing so, illuminated the dark corners of the night. As the parents began to arrive and the group dispersed, Leonid took a few steps closer. He remained unnoticed, partially hidden behind a low tree. The woman stayed behind, picking up juice cartons and forgotten mittens. He saw her pull a folded list from her coat and check off names with a dull pencil. She moved with the fatigue of someone used to long hours and modest reward, but not with resentment. Her weariness was the kind that came from giving fully, not from bitterness. He left without approaching her, but he returned the next evening, and the one after that. Days turned into weeks. Each night, Leonid made a habit of walking to the park and watching the woman whose name he still didn't know. She was consistent, always patient, always attentive with the children. Rain or clear skies, she was there. He learned her patterns, her rhythm, the way she clapped twice to gather the kids, the way she tilted her head when a child cried, the way she smiled to herself when they said something funny. These small, ordinary gestures stirred something extraordinary inside him. He began helping in small ways, fixing a broken swing, sweeping leaves off the slide. Once, he bought a box of warm pastries from a nearby cafe and left it quietly on the bench where she always sat. She never knew it was from him, but when she gave one to each child and kept none for herself, he smiled for the first time in weeks. In those silent evenings, Leonid felt peace. Not excitement or thrill. He had experienced enough of that to know how empty it could be. This was different. It was grounding, healing. He didn't need to impress anyone here. No one knew his net worth. No one expected anything. He was simply Leonid, the man in the dark jacket who fixed things. And yet, he was afraid. Afraid that if he spoke to her, the illusion would break. That she too would eventually look at him with calculation instead of curiosity. That the warmth would vanish the moment she learned who he really was. He kept telling himself he wasn't ready, but deep down he feared he had already fallen for someone who might disappear the moment his real world intruded. The turning point came on a Friday evening. It had been raining heavily, but the playground was still alive with laughter. One of the children slipped and scraped a knee. The woman, still a stranger in name, lifted the boy into her arms and held him close, soothing him with such quiet tenderness that Leonid felt a lump rise in his throat. He turned away that night and sat on a bench by the fountain, his face buried in his hands. The realization was heavy, undeniable. He didn't just admire her. He didn't just enjoy watching from afar. He wanted to be near her, to be known by her, to be worthy of the way she looked at those children, with compassion, not judgment. It was time. Not with a plan, not with a performance. Just the truth. That weekend, Leonid made a reservation at a small restaurant. Not the kind featured in magazines, but one known for homemade bread and quiet conversation. He told himself he would find her before Monday, introduce himself, ask for nothing, only to share a moment with someone who made him feel human again. The heart he thought he had lost among billions of dollars, among contracts and calendars and cold glass towers, had found a rhythm again. It beat stronger now, not for ambition or admiration, but for a woman in a raincoat who laughed with children in the dark. And, without even knowing her name, Leonid stepped into the unknown, chasing a feeling he thought he'd never find again. The following days unfolded like pages in a forgotten storybook, gentle and unhurried. Leonid continued his quiet ritual, returning each evening to the same park, watching from a short distance as the woman moved among the children like a calming breeze, steady and attentive. He still didn't know her name, yet he had memorized the slope of her shoulders, the way her fingers tucked stray hairs behind her ear, the rhythm of her steps on the gravel path. She existed in a world so far removed from the glass towers and marble floors of his empire that she might as well have come from another life altogether. And yet, it was to that life that he now longed to belong. He found himself carving out time between meetings and calls just to walk by the playground during daylight, observing the drawings on the fences made by small hands with bright chalk or the little flower pots set on windowsills of the nearby preschool building. Her world was textured with simplicity. It held meaning and shared laughter, hand-drawn posters, nap schedules, and finger-painted rainbows. In contrast, his own life, filled with numbers, contracts, and guarded conversations, felt like an echo chamber. But how could he approach her now, after weeks of watching from afar? What would he even say? That he had followed her with his eyes every evening, that he admired her for something she never meant to display. Would she find it flattering or frightening? Still, he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. One cold Tuesday, Leonid stood by the fence as the children were being picked up one by one. Only two remained, a little girl tying and untying her shoelaces and a boy singing softly to himself. The woman knelt beside them, helping with jackets and zippers, when Leonid stepped closer. She looked up as he approached, her expression open but cautious. There was no trace of recognition in her eyes, only a polite curiosity. He extended a hand and introduced himself, not as Leonid Markov, the Billionaire CEO, but simply as Leonid. Her name, as it turned out, was Anna. In the brief conversation that followed, he said little about himself, deflecting personal questions with self-effacing remarks or shifting attention back to the children. He asked about her work, and she spoke with a quiet pride about the preschool and the kids she cared for. She had always wanted to work with children. She believed in shaping kindness from the very beginning, when the world hadn't yet taught them fear or cynicism. She told him about the after-school group she volunteered for, how they used recycled materials to make art, and how some of the kids came from homes where the only meals they ate were at the daycare. Her voice trembled just slightly when she mentioned it, but she didn't dwell on hardship. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was simply stating reality, her reality. And in that moment, Leonid realized that this woman, who earned less in a year than he made in an hour, held a wealth he could never measure. She had purpose, integrity, quiet strength. He thanked her for talking to him and left before she could ask more. That night, he sat in his penthouse, surrounded by sleek furniture, abstract art, and walls of silence. The city stretched out beyond the glass, but he felt no connection to it. He opened his laptop and, without a second thought, began searching her preschool. It wasn't difficult to find. He saw photos of her class, articles about her fundraising bake sales, even a blurry local news clip of her helping plant trees in a community garden. Every detail affirmed what he already knew. Anna was rare. The next day, he returned to the park again, but this time with intention. Over the following week, he volunteered to help with minor repairs, repainting a bench, replacing screws on the seesaw, bringing a box of donated toys from one of his warehouses. Each time, she greeted him with a surprised smile, then thanked him with a sincerity that made his chest ache. She never once asked why he was there so often, nor did she pry into his past. Leonid found himself eager to do more. He quietly covered the cost of a broken heating system in one of the playrooms. Through a shell donation, he sponsored an educational trip to a nature center for the entire preschool. He never attached his name. He didn't want recognition. He only wanted to support the world she had built with her bare hands. As days turned to weeks, Anna's guard slowly softened. She began to wait for him at the edge of the park after the children left. They would talk about life, about values, about memories of childhood. She laughed easily, and when she listened, it was with her whole being. Leonid began to open up in ways he hadn't with anyone in years. Not about his company, not about boardrooms or business ventures, but about the emptiness that had followed him like a shadow. She never judged. She never flinched. Still, he knew there was a line he hadn't yet crossed. She didn't know who he really was. He feared what would happen when she found out. Would she walk away like the others? Would she feel betrayed? Would she think all his actions were a calculated move to impress her? The weight of the secret grew heavier with every passing day. Eventually, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He invited her to dinner. Not to a place of crystal chandeliers and tasting menus, but to a quiet, family-run Italian restaurant tucked away in a quiet side street. Candlelight flickered against brick walls, and the smell of garlic and baked bread filled the air. She wore a simple blue dress and looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and trust. Leonid took a deep breath and told her the truth. He told her who he was, not as a boast, but as a confession. He told her about the empire he had built, about the women who had used him, about the loneliness that had wrapped itself around his success. He told her that the only time he had felt real in years was when he watched her chase children through wet grass and wipe away tears with her sleeve. Anna didn't respond right away. Her expression shifted, not to shock or anger, but to silence. A long, thoughtful silence that felt heavier than words. She excused herself for a moment and stepped outside, standing in the cool air beneath the awning, staring at the empty street. Leonid remained at the table, his hands clasped, his throat dry. He knew she had every right to walk away. She had built her life on sincerity and truth. What must she think now? After what felt like an eternity, she returned. Her face was unreadable, but her voice was soft. She said she didn't know what to think yet, that it was a lot, that she needed time. Leonid nodded. He didn't push. In the days that followed, he didn't come to the park. He didn't want her to feel pressured. He waited in silence, unsure whether she would ever want to see him again. Then, one afternoon, as he sat alone on a bench watching the pigeons gather near the fountain, he heard a familiar voice behind him. Anna sat down beside him without a word and handed him a small paper bag. Inside was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He looked at her. She looked straight ahead. They ate in silence, side by side, as the city moved around them. And in that silence, Leonid felt something shift, not in her, but in himself. Acceptance. Patience. The quiet possibility of something real. Spring arrived quietly, painting the city in muted greens and delicate blossoms that clung to tree branches like forgotten dreams. The cold edge of winter had finally softened, and with it, so had the sharpness of Leonid's inner world. He no longer woke with the heaviness that had once sat on his chest like stone. His mornings, though still marked by quiet, were now filled with a different kind of silence, not one of emptiness, but of calm anticipation. The weight of wealth, power, and performance had not disappeared, but it had shifted. It no longer sat at the center of who he was. He saw Anna again and again, though not with declarations or demands. There were no luxury gifts, no overtures of grandeur. Instead, there were small gestures: a warm cup of tea brought to her classroom on cold mornings, a new box of art supplies for the children from a neighbor, a broken shelf in her coat room fixed while no one was looking. Each visit to the preschool playground felt like a quiet step toward something deeper. The children grew to expect him, running up to hug his legs, climbing into his arms with the ease of those who recognize safety when they see it. But the most profound moments weren't the ones filled with chatter and laughter. They were the pauses, the shared glances across the park, the brief touch of her hand on his arm when she thanked him, the silence between them that no longer felt awkward but full. Their connection had grown into something rooted, not impulsive, not performative, organic. Leonid never asked her to stop working. He never implied that she should leave the preschool behind, nor did she suggest it. In fact, watching her remain so grounded, so fiercely devoted to her role, only deepened his admiration. There was no arrogance in her humility. She took pride in small victories: a child learning to tie their shoes, a successful parent-teacher meeting, a handmade card left on her desk. Her life, though simple by comparison, was bursting with meaning. He began to spend more and more time in her world. At first, he thought he was offering support, resources, even protection. But he came to understand something far more humbling. He wasn't there to save her. She didn't need saving. He did. It was her presence, her values, her steady heart that pulled him back to the man he had once dreamed of becoming before the world told him to chase things instead of people. The press eventually caught wind of his frequent disappearances from corporate life. Rumors circulated, speculation flourished. Leonid had stepped away from the day-to-day operations of his company, handing over control to his board and reserving only a small stake. At meetings he attended now, he was quieter, more focused. He listened more, he spoke less, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. One morning, he walked into Anna's classroom holding a cardboard box. Inside were storybooks. Not just any books, first editions of beloved children's titles he had spent weeks tracking down. She smiled as she opened them one by one, her fingers running over the covers like fragile artifacts. The joy on her face was not for the price or the rarity, but for the stories themselves, for what they would mean to the children. Later that evening, as they walked home together, she told him something that stayed with him longer than any praise he'd ever received. "You don't make me feel like I'm small in your world," she said. "You make me feel like your world is big enough for both of us." Leonid didn't reply. He couldn't. There were no words that could touch the depth of what she had just given him. That spring, he helped her start a small initiative, a community center that offered free early education workshops, parenting classes, and meals for low-income families. They didn't announce it with fanfare. No ribbon cuttings, No media coverage, just a painted sign and an open door. And every morning, Anna stood at the entrance welcoming strangers as though they were old friends. He continued to show up, not as a benefactor, but as a man rebuilding himself piece by piece. He learned to fix leaky faucets, assemble shelves, manage spreadsheets for the center's donations. He even began reading bedtime stories aloud to the children during evening programs. At first, awkwardly, then with growing confidence, laughter, and eventually, joy. One night, after the center had closed for the day, they sat together on a low bench outside, watching the sky shift from gold to indigo. The last child had been picked up. The world was quiet. Anna leaned her head on his shoulder. He didn't move. He let the moment exist exactly as it was. That evening, he took her hand and looked at her with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with diamonds or estates or empires. "I used to think I had everything," he whispered, not aloud, but within himself. "But I was just wealthy. Now I'm rich in ways I never imagined." In the months that followed, their bond only deepened. They didn't rush. There was no need. Their connection had been forged not in fireworks, but in embers that had burned slowly and surely. And when he finally asked her to spend her life with him, it wasn't in a grand gesture or dramatic proposal. It was one evening, after they had just finished washing dishes at the community center, with their hands still damp and warm from the sink. She said yes, not to his name or his fortune, but to the life they had already begun building together. On the day of their wedding, the ceremony was held not in a cathedral or a luxury hotel, but in the modest courtyard of the center they had created side by side. The children from the preschool carried flowers in handmade baskets. Parents brought homemade treats. Volunteers set up folding chairs and string lights. It was imperfect and magical. There was no paparazzi, no headlines, just the sound of laughter, the hum of shared joy, and two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of places, on opposite sides of a life that was never meant to divide them. Leonid Markov, once a man drowning in affluence but starving for meaning, stood beside a woman whose entire life had been about giving more than she received. And together, they began a new chapter. Not one built on wealth or wonder, but on something far rarer. Truth, simplicity, and the kind of love that makes a person want to become their best self, not for the world, but for one person who saw them clearly when no one else could. And so, beneath the flowering trees and fading sun, among the laughter of children and the scent of homemade bread, Leonid finally understood what it meant to live fully, to love truly, and to be deeply, irreversibly known. If this story touched your heart, show your support by subscribing to the channel. It means the world to know you're with us, that you believe in real love too. And please, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every message.